I adjusted the collar of my blazer, exhaling slowly as I reviewed the final slide of my presentation. Years of hard work, late nights, and successful projects had led to this moment. The promotion to senior vice president was within reach. The numbers didn't lie. My division had outperformed every other team for the last 2 quarters, and even the CEO himself had praised my leadership. Sitting across from me in his corner office, Richard Palmer leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, that ever-present smirk playing on his lips. I knew that look. I had seen it every time he dismissed my ideas in meetings, only to miraculously present them as his own weeks later. I finished laying out my case, expecting a nod of approval. Instead, Richard let out a chuckle, low, condescending, and completely unbothered by the weight of my accomplishments. "Betty, let's be real," he said, shaking his head like I was some naive intern who just didn't get how the world worked. "People like you don't get promoted here." I felt the words slap against me, their meaning sharp and intentional. Richard leaned forward, lowering his voice as if he were letting me in on some secret. "You should just be grateful to have a seat at the table." For a split second, I saw red. Years of overlooked promotions, of being spoken over in meetings, of watching less competent, less experienced white colleagues move ahead of me. All of it boiled up, demanding to be unleashed. But I didn't react. I had learned long ago that anger wouldn't get me anywhere in a room full of men like him. Instead, I smiled, small, unreadable, but just enough to make him think he had won. "Of course, Richard," I said smoothly, standing up and collecting my portfolio. "Thank you for your feedback." His smirk deepened, mistaking my composure for submission. But what Richard didn't realize was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. I wasn't going to beg for what I had already earned. I was going to take it. And when the time came, he would regret every single word. I didn't waste time being angry. Anger without a strategy is just wasted energy. Instead, I started collecting receipts. Every unfair performance review, every time Richard promoted an unqualified white colleague over me, claiming they had more leadership potential. Every time I was spoken over in meetings, dismissed, or reduced to the team player rather than the architect of success. I documented it all. Dates, times, exact phrasing, carefully stored in a private folder on my personal laptop. Whenever possible, I recorded meetings discreetly, making sure that when the time came, I'd have undeniable proof. But I wasn't just playing defense. I needed powerful allies. At networking events, I made it a point to introduce myself to senior executives, board members, and decision makers. I learned their interests, engaged them in thoughtful conversations, and subtly made sure they knew my name, my work, and my value. It didn't take long for them to notice. "Betty, your division is killing it this quarter," one senior VP mentioned at a corporate gala. "How's Richard treating you? Hope he's not holding you back." I let out a soft, knowing laugh. "Oh, you know Richard. He has his way of doing things." A non-answer, but just vague enough to plant the seed of doubt. At the same time, I started mentoring younger Black employees, making sure that I wasn't the only one fighting this battle. I taught them how to navigate the system, play the game, and claim their space without losing themselves in the process. Meanwhile, Richard, completely oblivious, thought I had given up. He thought I had accepted my place. He had no idea he was standing on a sinking ship. And me? I was already building my empire. When the Harrison account opened up, I already knew I was the most qualified person to lead it. I had worked closely with the client for over a year, studied their financial trends, and even pitched an early version of the strategy that won them over in the first place. But when I walked into the morning meeting, ready to take charge, Richard barely looked at me before handing the project to Travis. Travis, his drinking buddy. Travis, who had never closed a deal on his own. Travis, who once asked me what an EBITDA was during a finance meeting. I kept my face neutral as Richard announced the decision like it was the most natural thing in the world. Travis will be leading the Harrison project," he said, smirking at me. "It's important we put someone in charge who understands our executive clients, someone who fits in." I knew what he meant. Travis looked the part. I never would. Fine, let him have it. Let them watch him crash and burn. And that's exactly what happened. Within weeks, the account was in chaos. Emails went unanswered. Deadlines were missed. The Harrison team, one of our biggest clients, was furious. I had a choice. Let the account fail and watch Richard scramble for damage control, or step in quietly and fix it. I chose the latter. I worked behind the scenes, reviewing contracts, fixing Travis's mistakes before the client even noticed, ensuring numbers were accurate, and making sure Harrison's CEO felt heard and respected, something Travis was incapable of doing. By the time the quarterly review came around, Harrison's leadership requested a private meeting with our executives. Richard looked smug as we walked into the boardroom, assuming they'd be congratulating Travis. Instead, the Harrison CEO smiled at me and said, "We'd like to formally request Betty as our point of contact moving forward. She's the only reason we're still here." Silence. Richard's face went pale. Travis swallowed hard. I just smiled and said, "Of course, I'd be happy to lead the account." Word traveled fast. It wasn't just the Harrison account. Other major clients had started requesting me too. Executives began noticing, department heads started asking me to sit in on meetings, and even the CEO himself made a passing comment about my strong leadership during a company-wide event. Richard was losing control, and he knew it. He tried to downplay it. "She's just good with people," I overheard him telling someone in the hallway. "Clients get comfortable with her. Doesn't mean she's ready for leadership." But his voice lacked the usual confidence, because deep down he understood the truth. I was already leading. I didn't need permission to be a leader, I just was one. But that wasn't enough. I knew what happened to Black women in corporate spaces. Hard work alone doesn't guarantee success. For every Travis in the world, men who fail upwards, I had to be twice as prepared, twice as strategic. So I started planning my next move. If this company refused to promote me, I'd find another way up. I started reaching out to competitors, building relationships with recruiters, and keeping my options open. At the same time, I strengthened my alliances within the company. I built a circle of executive sponsors, people who had influence and respected my work. I mentored junior Black employees, ensuring I wasn't the only one making moves. I documented everything, every milestone, every client success, every time I cleaned up Richard's mess. Because when the time came, I wouldn't just take my promotion. I'd take his job. The email landed in my inbox like any other. Subject: Internal Review, Confidential. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I wasn't part of HR, and I definitely wasn't part of the executive team. But as soon as I opened the attachment, my heart stopped. The document detailed diversity complaints, racial discrimination claims, and internal HR investigations. The company had been quietly settling complaints behind closed doors to avoid bad press, and Richard's name showed up more than once. One claim in particular caught my eye: repeatedly passing over a Black female employee for promotions in favor of less qualified white candidates. It wasn't just me. I scanned the names of complainants. Some I knew, some I didn't. Women who had been in my exact position, women who had been pushed out, silenced, forced to resign after years of being undervalued. This company had a pattern, and now I had the receipts. I knew how corporations worked. If word got out, it wouldn't just be an HR issue, it would be a PR disaster. Investors would panic. The company's reputation would shatter. I forwarded the document to my personal email and immediately contacted my employment lawyer. We had spoken in the past about my stalled career progression, but now I had something concrete. "This is gold," she said when I showed her the file. "They're terrified of lawsuits. If they think you're going public with this, they'll do anything to make you stay quiet." But I didn't want a settlement. I wanted leverage. I wanted power. So I kept quiet, biding my time, waiting for the perfect moment. Because when I made my move, I wanted them to feel it. 3 weeks later, I got a call from an executive recruiter. "I don't know if you're open to new opportunities," she said, "but a high-level position just opened up at Sterling & Company. They're looking for a VP of strategy, and your name came up." Sterling & Company was our firm's biggest competitor, a powerhouse in finance. And they weren't just offering me a promotion, they were offering me a leadership track. I didn't say yes immediately. I played it smart, I negotiated. More salary, more stock options, guaranteed decision-making power, and the most important part, I made sure Richard found out. It didn't take long. News traveled fast. Executives whispered in hallways. Senior leaders started suddenly inviting me to lunches, meetings, casual check-ins. Richard looked rattled. "I heard Sterling made you an offer," he said one afternoon, his voice laced with forced indifference. "Thinking of jumping ship?" I smiled. "Oh, you know, exploring my options." And just like that, the power balance shifted. For the first time, he was the one who felt replaceable. Because now, I wasn't just an employee, I was a threat. Richard was sweating. I could see it in the way he watched me now, eyes darting whenever I walked into a meeting, in the way he tried, and failed, to act unfazed when executives casually greeted me in the hallways. For years, he had controlled my career, kept me boxed in. But now I was slipping out of his grasp. So he did what weak men in power always do when they feel threatened. He tried to destroy me. The email came late on a Friday. Subject, performance concerns. Betty Harrison. I skimmed the contents, and I almost laughed. Richard was blaming me for the Harrison account fiasco. He claimed I had overstepped my role and created confusion with the client, that I was difficult to work with, that I wasn't leadership material. And the best part? He CC'd HR. I smiled to myself. He really thought he could outmaneuver me. By Monday morning, I was sitting in a conference room, face to face with HR, the legal team, and Richard himself. He had that smug expression again, like he had already won. "Betty," HR began, "there have been concerns raised about your role in the Harrison account. Can you clarify your involvement?" I nodded and pulled out my receipts, emails, messages. Detailed documentation of every correction I had made, every time I had stepped in to fix Travis's mistakes. Then I pulled out something even better, a file on Richard himself. "Before we continue," I said calmly, sliding the folder across the table, "I think it's important we discuss these findings as well." HR's brows furrowed as they flipped through it. A timeline of every instance Richard had passed me over for a promotion, proof of his favoritism toward white employees, transcripts of inappropriate remarks, casual racism disguised as jokes. And, of course, the confidential report that showed I wasn't the only black woman he had held back. The room went silent. Richard's face turned red. HR exchanged glances before one of the legal reps stood up and left the room, probably to call the CEO. By the time the meeting ended, I wasn't the one being investigated. Richard was. 2 days later, I was called into the executive boardroom. This time, there was no Richard. Instead, the CEO himself sat at the head of the table, flanked by senior executives and legal counsel. "We'll get straight to the point, Betty," he said, folding his hands on the table. "Richard has been placed on leave while we conduct a formal investigation." I nodded, unfazed. I already knew that. Richard had been spiraling since the HR meeting, pacing his office, making desperate calls. His downfall was inevitable. "But," the CEO continued, "that's not why we called you here." I raised a brow. "We recognize the value you bring to this company. We also recognize that mistakes have been made." He cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. "We'd like to correct that." The offer was laid out in front of me. A leadership role, a seat at the decision-making table, and most importantly, control over Richard's entire department, the very department that he had kept me from leading. I kept my expression neutral, though inside I could already feel the victory settling in. "I'll need some conditions met," I said, voice steady. "Of course," the CEO said quickly. "Name them." I smiled. I had spent years playing this game, but now I was the one making the rules. The email went out at 9 a.m. sharp. Subject, leadership announcement, senior vice president promotion. By 9:03, my phone buzzed nonstop. By 9:10, the office was buzzing. Whispers, murmurs, stunned reactions. By 9:30, Richard stormed into the break room and nearly shattered his coffee mug. I had officially been named Senior Vice President of Strategy, 2 full ranks above Richard. And the best part? I was now his boss's boss. I strolled into the office like I had every other day, but this time, people saw me differently. The same executives who once overlooked me now rushed to congratulate me. Junior employees, especially the black ones, exchanged knowing glances, their smiles barely concealed. Richard, on the other hand, he was pale, tense, avoiding eye contact. I saw him standing in the hallway talking to his last few allies. I didn't need to eavesdrop to know what he was saying. It's just diversity politics. They had to fill a quota. She doesn't even have leadership experience. Let him talk. Let him scramble. Because the moment I walked into my new office, the office that belonged to his old boss, it was clear to everyone in this building. Richard was done. First order of business? A full department-wide audit. Richard had been untouchable for years. He had made sure no one could question his decisions, protected his inner circle, and built his career on covering up his incompetence. But now, I was in charge, and I had receipts. The accounting team confirmed what I already suspected. Richard had been funneling company funds into business expenses that were anything but. Lavish client dinners that never included clients. Travel expenses that coincidentally lined up with his personal vacations. Bonuses handed out to his drinking buddies while actual top performers got nothing. Then the HR team reached out. They had been flooded with complaints, not just about his racist comments and blatant favoritism, but about how he treated employees in general. The stories started pouring in. Black employees consistently passed over for promotions. Women given more work but less pay. Juniors forced to handle his messes while he took credit. Talented employees quitting because they couldn't deal with his bullying. And now that he wasn't in power anymore, people weren't afraid to talk. One former employee even emailed me directly. I left the company 2 years ago because of Richard. I wish I could have stayed to see this. Make sure he gets what he deserves. Oh, I would. I would make sure everyone saw what happened to men like him when the power shifted. Richard had spent years abusing his position. Now, it was time for consequences. I had everything I needed. The audit uncovered thousands in fraudulent expenses. Human resources had piles of complaints spanning years. Employees came forward with stories of bullying, discrimination, and blatant misconduct. Richard was finished. But I wasn't just going to fire him. I was going to make it public. HR scheduled a disciplinary meeting. Richard assumed it would be another slap on the wrist. He had walked out of dozens of these unscathed before. He thought this would be the same. I made sure it wasn't. The invite went out, marked as an internal review meeting. Richard was cocky when he walked in, adjusting his tie like he was just here to smooth things over. Then he looked up and saw me sitting at the head of the table, his face drained of color. "Go ahead and have a seat, Richard," I said smoothly. "We have a lot to discuss." For the first time since I had known him, he was speechless. The entire department was gathered, over 40 employees. I stood at the front of the room, HR and legal flanking me on either side. Richard sat at the conference table, his hands clenched into fists, his face growing redder by the second. I flipped open the file. Richard Palmer is under review for multiple violations, including expense fraud, ethical misconduct, creating a hostile work environment, discriminatory hiring practices. Murmurs rippled through the room. People were nodding. I could see the junior employees finally realizing they weren't crazy. "Richard," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "for years, you've taken credit for work you didn't do. You've held back employees who deserved better. You've abused your position, thinking there would never be consequences." He tried to interrupt, but I held up a hand. "I'm not finished." I turned to HR. "Would you like to proceed with the official verdict?" The HR director cleared her throat. "Effective immediately, Richard Palmer's employment with this company is terminated." Gasps. Someone actually clapped. Richard shot out of his chair. "You can't do this!" I smiled. "Oh, but I could." I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough so the whole room could hear. "Richard, let's be real. People like you don't get second chances here." His own words, the exact ones he had used to deny me my promotion. Now, they were his exit line. Security stepped in. He stumbled back, humiliated, sweating, shaking with rage. And me? I just watched him go. Justice delivered. Richard stumbled backward, his chair scraping against the floor as security moved in. His face was a mask of disbelief, as if he still hadn't fully processed what had just happened. "This isn't over," he sputtered, eyes darting around the room. But there was no one left to back him up. His old allies sat frozen, too afraid to defend him. The employees he had bullied for years. Some were actively smirking. A few exchanged quiet high fives. One person, Travis, his golden boy, actually started clapping. And then, like a slow-building wave, others joined in. Richard's face went beet red. "Get your things," the security officer said, nudging him toward the door. He looked at me, eyes filled with hatred and desperation. I just smiled. For years, he had controlled my fate. Now, I controlled his. I watched as he walked out for the last time, shoulders hunched, the weight of his downfall settling in. As soon as the doors closed behind him, the room erupted. Laughter, cheers, a collective exhale that had been held in for far too long. A few employees turned to me. "Does this mean we can actually get promoted now?" One of the junior analysts joked. I smiled. "It means everything is about to change." And I meant it. The next morning, the company released an official statement. It addressed past hiring and promotional disparities and a renewed commitment to diversity, inclusion, and leadership accountability. And at the very end, a public acknowledgement of my work. We thank Betty Harrison for her leadership in helping shape a more equitable future for our company. Richard had spent years trying to erase my contributions. Now, my name was the one being written into company history. With Richard gone, the office felt different. Lighter, safer, better. For the first time in years, people spoke freely in meetings without fear of being mocked or undermined. Employees who had been pushed aside under Richard's leadership now had a seat at the table. And I made sure of it. I restructured the department, removing the old systems that had protected incompetence and rewarded mediocrity. Promotions were now based on actual merit, not favoritism. I went through every personnel file, identifying employees who had been overlooked, underpaid, or kept in stagnant positions for too long. By the end of the first quarter, I had promoted 5 employees Richard had held back for years. 3 of them were Black professionals who had been told, directly or indirectly, that they'd never move up. "You're the first Black woman to ever sit in this office," one of them, Maya, told me when I called her in for her promotion. I smiled. "I won't be the last." But it wasn't just about my success. I started mentoring younger Black professionals, hosting career development sessions, and making sure nobody else had to fight the battles I did alone. I implemented new diversity initiatives, pushing for policies that would ensure promotions were based on actual skill, not backroom politics. And the best part? Our department thrived. Productivity skyrocketed. Client retention improved. The toxic work culture Richard had cultivated was gone. At our next executive meeting, the CEO leaned back in his chair, looking at me. "Looks like we should have promoted you a long time ago," he said with a chuckle. I simply smiled. "Yes, you should have." 1 year later, I stood backstage at the National Business Leadership Conference, waiting for my cue. The room beyond the curtain was packed. Executives, industry leaders, young professionals looking for inspiration. They had introduced me as Senior Vice President of Strategy, award-winning leader, and champion for workplace equity, a title Richard had once laughed at the idea of me having. Now, it was mine. I stepped onto the stage, the bright lights warming my skin, and took in the audience. A sea of expectant faces, some skeptical, some excited, some just waiting to hear how the hell I had pulled this off. I adjusted the mic, smiled, and began. A year ago, I was told I'd never get promoted because of my race. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I let it sink in. Then I continued. I was passed over, dismissed, told to just be grateful for a seat at the table. I glanced at the front row, where a group of young black women in business suits sat wide-eyed, hanging on to my every word. But instead of getting bitter, I got better. Instead of getting angry, I got strategic. I walked across the stage, locking eyes with the audience. I didn't beg for my promotion. I didn't wait for permission. I took it. Applause. I smiled, but I wasn't done. And the man who told me I'd never move up? I paused for effect, scanning the crowd, watching as they leaned in. He works at a gas station now. The room erupted. Laughter, cheers, full-on standing ovation. I let them have the moment, then raised a hand, bringing the energy back in. But this story isn't just about revenge, it's about change. I pointed toward the women in the front row. Because when I broke through that barrier, I didn't just do it for me. I did it so that the next black woman who walks into a boardroom doesn't have to fight the same damn fight. Silence. Then, deafening applause. I stepped back, letting the moment settle, knowing deep in my soul. This wasn't just my victory, this was a revolution.